Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is David Hoffman. I am an assistant professor of bioethics at Columbia University, and I am thrilled to welcome you to our event tonight. It's going to be a really interesting discussion. It will be made more interesting if you utilize the question and answer box on your Zoom screen and ask some probing, indelicate, but polite questions, because there's a lot of ground to be covered here that needs some aggressive questioning. So we hope you will take advantage and participate in this evening's program, but it will be interesting regardless. It is, of course, an interesting time in academia, in bioethics, in the intersection of law, ethics, and medicine. That is no more apparent than the events that have been going on campus for the last several days and for the last several months, but more so recently. And we should acknowledge that this event tonight is part of the very proud tradition of academia in general, Columbia in particular, of confronting difficult topics. It's not often that those difficult topics result in sit-ins and encampments and involvement of the police, but so be it. That's part of a vigorous debate and a tolerance of civil disobedience. So we should recognize that as a value as well as something that's quite upsetting. So we are here to discuss psilocybin versus the DEA, although candidly, we probably should be discussing the DEA versus psilocybin, but I wanted it to be very clear that we were talking about psilocybin from the perspective of law, ethics, society, and of course, drugs. Here we have the legally required notice to any of the participants tonight who will be seeking New York State CLE credit. We're obligated to provide that notice. We are also obligated to identify the participants, myself, Linda Brooks Mutual, who I will introduce shortly, Stephen Field likewise, and Daniel Arshak. The presenters have disclosed no financial conflict of interest, but it's always worth noting that our opinions are those of ourselves and not the institutions with which we might be affiliated. Before we get started, I want to touch on not why we're here, more on that later, but how we got here. And that is on account of an extraordinary human being, Nancy Dubler, who passed away this past Monday. Nancy, who you see pictured here with Dan and I and our friend and colleague Ken Berkowitz, were part of Nancy's pilot program in training clinical ethicists in 1994. She was, and I will try to get through this next part without losing my voice, the most extraordinary mentor anyone could possibly ask for. And though she is no longer with us, which is so upsetting, she is immortal because of the thousands of students that she has trained, many of whom I consider my closest friends, not to mention all of the people that we have trained and brought into the family of bioethics. So Nancy, I hope you enjoy this. So what are we going to do tonight? We're going to talk about where psilocybin fits within the legal structure of regulation around that certain group of chemicals that we call drugs. So we're going to look at this from the perspective of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act and the Controlled Substances Act. And we're going to ask all of the questions that we confront tonight about psilocybin from the perspective of this question: is it worse than alcohol? Which is an important part of the case for rescheduling. Obviously, more on rescheduling later. Then we will hear from Linda, who will talk about psilocybin from a pharmacist's perspective and how it works and what it can do for patients that other drugs can't. Then we'll turn to sort of the social and ethical history of psilocybin with Stephen Field, who is a friend and colleague in ethics consultation. More of an introduction on his background later. And we're going to look at this from the perspective of the enormous amount of data, albeit not published in peer-reviewed medical journals, but the lived experience of indigenous communities and what that has to do with the question of whether psilocybin should be rescheduled. We'll then look at the downside of not rescheduling it. That is the criminal implications of a chemical, a drug that has had a strong history of effectiveness and safety. What does it mean for its use and its possession to be against the law? Dan will present that. And then we'll dive into a panel discussion for all of us looking at whether making psilocybin a Schedule I drug ever made sense, and does it still now? So that's our agenda for tonight. So let's remind ourselves why we are here. This is a quote that was shared with us by a nurse from the Columbia University Irving Medical Center, Nakia Alexander, at a program we did a year or two ago on implicit bias and systemic racism. And it has stuck with me. Nakia's patient said, "As a patient that has experienced microaggressions in healthcare, it feels like you have to constantly advocate for yourself, and that is exhausting." So we should bear that in mind as we consider the legal and ethical context for all regulation, all impairment of the individual liberties of patients. And we can't start that discussion without referencing Schlöendorff. Benjamin Cardozo, in this groundbreaking, really revolutionary decision in 1914, said that every human being of adult years and sound mind has a right to determine what shall be done with his own body. Odd gender choice, given that Schlöendorff was Mary Schlöendorff, and she was bringing this litigation because of her mistreatment of a fibroid, a uterine fibroid condition. But that ought to ground us in the notion that the law and medical practice, professional ethical standards, ought not to interfere with a patient's ability to determine what will be done to their body unless there's a really good reason. So let me give you a bit of an introduction to set the stage for tonight's program. And in particular, let's talk just for a few moments about the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. That is, of course, the law that created the notion of the prescription pad, right? It was the law's response to what were perceived to be snake oil potions, some of which were effective, but really the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act was designed to address those that were not effective and were not, frankly, safe. Oops, sorry. So notwithstanding that the FDA has recognized psilocybin as a breakthrough therapy and authorized dozens and dozens of exemptions in order to study psilocybin, including at well-respected medical institutions, Johns Hopkins, NYU, many others. The DEA has dug in its heels and has refused to even start the process for considering rescheduling of psilocybin, which, as you will learn, the law requires. This all has to be considered from the perspective of how the law deals with breakthrough drugs generally. So we have in this nation a variety of laws. We have the compassionate use exemption from approval of drugs through the FDA. We have right to try laws that take that entitlement, that empowerment of patients even further by saying, even if the FDA has not yet gotten around to approving a particular chemical formulation, that patients under appropriate circumstances ought to have access to those drugs. But of course, that's difficult because the DEA takes the position that it has no authority to permit such use because psilocybin is a Schedule I drug. More on that later as well. So the Controlled Substance Act and the right to try laws were clearly intended to protect the public from dangerous and ineffective medications. But at the same time, the Controlled Substance Act contains a provision that says that the DEA ought to be opened to consultation with the FDA in order to determine whether advances in scientific knowledge have yielded insights that some drugs that were originally thought to be dangerous, maybe requiring a prescription or maybe being prohibited altogether, are in fact safer than had originally been thought. And it doesn't make sense to provide legal protection to the public that doesn't provide any protection at all. We learned that in a dramatic way in the early days of the HIV/AIDS epidemic, where the government stood in the way of access to AZT, saying to people with advanced AIDS, oh, we can't let you have this drug because we're not sure it's safe, to which the ACT UP movement and Gay Men's Health Crisis, on whose IRB Dan served many, many years ago, those folks said, who the hell do you think you are telling us that a drug might not be safe when we're all dying? Which is to make this simple point. Sometimes government can do best for its citizens by simply stepping out of the way. Drug scheduling is complicated, right? What is the purpose of drug scheduling? It serves many purposes, some of which I'm going to address from a regulatory perspective, some of which Dan is going to address from a criminal law perspective. But at core, drug scheduling is the categorization of drugs to define which ones require a greater or lesser extent of oversight. So Schedule I, the nasty drugs, psilocybin being one of them, are drugs that have no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. The interesting thing is that along with marijuana and peyote, which is in this context representative of all the psychedelics, we have drugs like heroin and LSD. We ought to ask ourselves, from a legal and an ethical perspective, why is it that we lump marijuana and psilocybin in the same category as heroin and LSD? And we're hoping to get to the bottom of that question today. Schedule II are drugs that have a medical use, though the DEA doesn't acknowledge that in its definition. These are the DEA definitions, by the way. But they are drugs with a high potential for abuse, with use potentially leading to severe psychological or physical dependence. And in here, we have nasty drugs: cocaine, oxycodone, fentanyl being the drug that is most concerning to the DEA. If you walk into the DEA headquarters, which I have, the walls of the lobby are literally wallpapered with photographs and narratives of people who have died from fentanyl overdoses. And yet it's a medically accepted drug. Fair question, why? Schedule III are those drugs with moderate to low potential for physical and psychological dependence, but nonetheless potentially harmful. Ketamine, a drug that was accepted in medical practice and then was vilified and now is being brought back, interestingly enough. Linda will have a little to say about that later. And drugs like testosterone. Then there's Schedule 4 and 5. They don't so much touch on our discussion tonight. Why am I involved in this question? Well, because I got a phone call a couple of years ago asking if I would submit or participate in submitting an amicus curiae, a friend of the court brief, to the United States District Court for the Ninth Circuit that was reviewing the petition of Dr. Sunil Aggarwal, who submitted an application to the Drug Enforcement Administration, and they rejected it for the reasons I reviewed earlier. And he decided to appeal that decision. And those appeals go to the Circuit Court of Appeals, in this case, the Ninth Circuit out in California. And let me say a little something about the DEA now, just to create some context. Ann Milgram, whose name appears in that caption, who is now the administrator of the DEA, she has done a remarkable job modernizing the DEA. When the DEA issued some regulations restricting use of telemedicine for prescribing of narcotics, and there was an uproar from the medical community. She scheduled a public hearing and sat for hours listening to a variety of individuals, including myself, testify about the importance of telemedicine access to pain medications, particularly, as I explained, patients at the end of life who need medication to relieve not only pain, but existential dread. And so I'm hopeful that this new attitude at the DEA, together with the decision I'm about to explain to you, will result in some more rapid progress toward a more reasoned approach to regulating drugs. So happy news in the context of the advocacy effort to get a second look at psilocybin. The Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a decision just this past winter, and it was a long caption. Lots of people weighed in, but the conclusion on October 20th of 2023 was that, in fact, the DEA has a legal obligation to consult with the FDA and have the FDA ascertain whether psilocybin has any appropriate medical use, such that the DEA would be compelled to follow the FDA's advice and reschedule psilocybin from Schedule 1 to either Schedule 2 or Schedule 3. So that's progress. And it's progress that's badly needed because there are a lot of controlled substances. This is just the first page of the DEA's alphabetical list of all controlled substances. It goes on for 22 pages. And on page 21, they're wedged between, well, I'm not even going to try to pronounce those, between two other drugs, one a narcotic and one not, rests psilocybin, Schedule 1, with an identification number of 7437. These drugs are obviously potentially dangerous. Any drug, any chemical can be, but we need to understand where psilocybin sits in the hierarchy of drugs, both in terms of danger and effectiveness. And for that purpose, I have invited Linda Brooks Uchel to join us. Linda is a critical care pharmacist at the University of Texas Southwestern Medical Center. She is a student in Columbia's bioethics master's program, and she is the person I always turn to when I have a question about drugs in a legal context. So Linda has styled her presentation tonight, Psilocybin Hype or Hope. And Linda, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, David. And it's a pleasure to be with all of you this evening. I know it's primarily a group of attorneys, but I know also some of my ethicist friends and healthcare professionals from hospitals and organizations are here as well. So I'm going to try to be able to present at many different levels. And if somebody has a question, please come back at me with a question and we can talk about something maybe in a little bit more depth. The history of psilocybin, as you guys know, is very interesting. And that's something that we're going to talk about and highlight tonight in some of the presentations that come after me. Next slide, David.
Sorry.
Um, but I mean, I was just interested in hearing what the word psychedelic came from. It was actually coined in a letter to Aldous Huxley by the psychiatrist Humphrey Osmond. And it's from the Greek, psych, the mind or soul, delos, to show, mind manifesting. And I think that kind of dovetails into what I'm going to be describing today about psilocybin and some of its mechanism of action. Next slide. The timeline for psilocybin's research and then stop of research coincides with the Controlled Substances Act, as David just spoke about. Things were cooking along from the synthesis of LSD in 1938. Psilocybin was actually isolated. And then in 1970, everything came to a halt. Whether that was political, because Richard Nixon's war on drugs maybe looked at the population of people that were using psilocybin at that time for recreational use and kind of lumped that together with other drugs. Whether it was because of safety and efficacy, I mean, looking back on it, it's really hard to tell. But I think it was a mixed bag. And I think some of the hype that I'm going to talk about tonight comes from that stigma, that reputation that came about in the 70s. David highlighted the Controlled Substance Act, so important in this discussion, because we are hoping that the DEA is going to look at psilocybin and objectively look at the science to see where it fits in to the Controlled Substance Act schedules. Next slide. What is the pharmacology? I want to give everyone just a basic look at what psilocybin is and why it's a little bit different from some of the other drugs that we are using for the indications that it's being studied for now. Next slide.
Sorry, I was muted. Rest assured, I've warned Linda that most of us never took chemistry. So thank you, Linda.
It's been a bit for me too. This is a picture of psilocybe cubanesis. This is the one that is used for the current standard for potency for psilocybin in its natural format. It's native to Northern, Central, and South America. And as everyone knows, it's been used by indigenous populations for hundreds of years. Next slide. It's taken actually now in its dried form, or it can be taken in an intravenous preparation. The intravenous and the oral preparation actually is what we call bioequivalent. They're equivalent in strength. And as you can see from the molecular structure, and if you looked at the molecular structure of this compared to some of the other psychedelics, it would be very similar in structure. Next slide. Psilocybin is actually what we call in the pharmaceutical world is a prodrug. So you take psilocybin, but it's actually metabolized by esterases into its active form, which is psilocin. And you'll hear some chemical companies talking about using psilocin, the actually active drug, instead of using the prodrug, psilocybin. And psilocybin turns into psilocin, and then it acts on the serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor, to activate the receptor and to do the pharmacologic action that we're expecting, just like other antidepressants and neurochemical type agents will work on different other receptors. I guess my point is that receptors and the target for receptors are different drug to drug. Not every drug does the same thing. Not every psychedelic does the same thing. Psilocybin's action is pretty much specific for, or the main action is specific for this serotonin receptor. Next slide. So it is an agonist at that receptor. And the receptor that we're talking about for psilocybin actually exists within the cell. It's not an external receptor like a lot of the other antidepressants work on. They work on a receptor to build up the neurochemical between the two parts of the neuron, but psilocybin is working internally. And that's important because it has a few less side effects because of that, and may have fewer drug interactions because of that. It decreases activity of the default mode network in the cortex, and it decreases the activity of the amygdala, which is the way that the serotonin receptor acts that's agonized by the psilocybin. Next slide, please. The onset of psilocybin is 10 to 40 minutes, and it depends on the person and the dose. Peaks in about 60 to 90 minutes with a half-life of 3 hours. The duration of effect, which is very important when we're talking about psilocybin's barriers to use, is quite long. It's 3 to 6 hours. Metabolism, it's dephosphorylated, which is basically not something we need to worry about in the pharmacy world. It doesn't hit on a lot of different compounds for drug interactions, although we will be concerned about studying those interactions. We haven't really done a good job of that yet. Next slide. I just showed a synaptic cleft with the serotonin receptor that psilocybin is specific for. If you look at the purple circle on the right, that is psilocybin working on the receptor that's inside the cell. And as you can see, the action is being formulated right off that receptor with the blue, the hallucinogen signaling. So it's a different receptor than the receptors that are building up the serotonin, as you can see in the middle of the two parts of the neuron. It doesn't do that. It works more internally. Next slide, please. I want to give a shout out right now for the default mode network. The default mode network is like the symphony conductor in the brain. It actually holds back and organizes all the different influences that are going on in the brain. It lights up when there's no demands on our attention, and it's very active when our mind wanders. It's kind of holding back all that wandering and trying to keep things very organized. And it's in very regimented pathways that it learns over time. The decreased activity of the default mode network with psilocybin is one of the ways that it works. Old destructive loops that have been going on and being held back over time are changed, maybe even rewiring, so new connections are formed. I'm going to go ahead and show you a picture. Actually, it's a type of encephalography. Next slide. Looking at a placebo on your left, that's if someone's taking a placebo, that's your default mode network doing its job. You see how everything looks very organized? Like is talking to like. It's very orderly. With psilocybin on the right, the default mode network has been let loose, and all these new connections are formed. And it's thought that these new connections being formed while you take psilocybin allows the brain to kind of step back and rewire itself afterwards using some therapy and integration after the event, and maybe helps to reconnect people that are having issues with things like post-traumatic stress, other little kindling problems, people with depression, where there's a lot of rumination and there's a lot of problems with that default mode network being very formulated. So it's a very interesting mode of action, and it's a little bit unique to psilocybin, although some of the other hallucinogenics also work in this area. Next slide. This slide is just to show you again how all these drugs are different. I mean, you can see on the top at about 1 o'clock LSD and how it works and all the receptors it works with, including dopamine, as well as serotonin. You see psilocybin, DMT going around the clock, MDMA, which has also been used for some of the similar indications as psilocybin, and then ketamine. And again, these are different targets, different receptors, and you're going to expect different chemical activity, different side effects, and most importantly for this discussion, different maybe habit forming or reward forming or ability to be, as they say, dependent on the drug because of that mechanism of action. Next slide. It's important to point out that that break in research that we had for 25 or more years took us off track. Right now, with psilocybin, the optimum dose is not certain. Most studies with depression and some of the things that we're looking at now, we're talking about giving it a single dose somewhere from 8 milligrams to 35 milligrams. Sometimes it's a weight-based dose based on a 70-kilogram person. And how often we give it, we don't know how often to give it either. Usually it's like calling on the telephone. It's like you take it, you hang up, things are rewired, and then maybe you do it again in 4 to 6 weeks. I mean, the studies vary, and we don't have enough data yet to know the answer. And then there's microdosing. Will microdosing help? Will that help maybe diminish some of the not so pleasant effects of psilocybin by taking it in smaller amounts more often, sub-hallucinogenic doses? Or does that expose the patient maybe to more side effects long-term? People talk a little bit about cardiovascular side effects. Perhaps we're going to see more long-term side effects with microdosing than we do with just those single hits, because we're looking in the studies and sometimes one hit's enough. One episode of taking the psilocybin is enough in one of the recent studies that came out for depression. Whereas maybe more of them have a two-hit where people take it once and then another time, maybe 4 weeks later. And who knows, maybe they can, or maybe they don't have to take it again after that. We don't know the answer. A lot's unknown, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. Next slide. The subject of adverse effects, you know that's going to come up. It's important to look at this. Most of them, though, with psilocybin are tolerable. Most of them resolve in 24 to 48 hours. You get a sympathomimetic response, increased blood pressure and heart rate. Up to 26% say that they do feel some anxiety during that part where they're on the trip with psilocybin. Sometimes people will wake up and they'll be a little bit concerned. And again, this is being given usually under controlled conditions. You're not by yourself, you're guided. And the guide helps people to kind of calm down. It's going to be okay. Relax. You'll get through this. Headache. You can see a substantial percentage of patients in some studies have headache and nausea and dizziness. There's sometimes an alteration in the sense of time when you're on the trip. And hallucinations can occur and synesthesias. And that's kind of like the best way to explain it is you taste something that you see, or you see something that you hear, almost like people described when they were taking LSD. Next slide. The best thing to talk about, I think, is the long-term effects and safety when you're talking about indications like potential indications like PTSD or depression. But it looks like these drugs, at least specifically psilocybin, doesn't have reinforcing properties. It lacks that dopamine-mediated reinforcement that you would need to have an addictive compound. There's no drug-seeking behavior seen in studies with psilocybin. And although repeated dosing can downregulate that serotonin receptor, there isn't that craving or that wanting to go ahead and get the high that you might see with some of the other drugs that may have been talked about for some indications similar to what we're talking about for psilocybin. Next slide. Drug interactions is another thing that I was very surprised to see. There doesn't seem to be a lot reported in the depression literature anyway. And it looks like using that mechanism of action with the internal serotonin receptor, maybe serotonin syndrome, which is something that can occur when a serotonin antidepressant is mixed with another serotonin releasing antidepressant. Maybe that won't occur with psilocybin. We don't know yet. We still don't have the data, but it's possible that it may have less of an occurrence with psilocybin than it does with other antidepressant drugs. What we do know is that there is a possibility for psilocybin's effect to be reduced in the presence of some drugs like buspirone, chlorpromazine, haloperidol, and risperidone. And we do need further data to see, because when the drug is regulated less, it's possible that patients who are taking some of these other drugs for depression or bipolar disease may be reaching out for psilocybin, whether or not their provider thinks it's a good idea. Next slide. But you're talking about things like adverse effects and possible anxiety, maybe a dysesthesia or something where, the person is uncomfortable while they're taking a medication. I think the issue of consent needs to be talked about in studies. And there are people right now talking about using psilocybin for indications where perhaps truly informed consent is difficult to get. I think it's one of those things where we'd have to kind of step back and look at the individual clinical situation and see whether or not we feel that that patient was actually able to consent to the fact that they may very well have an adverse experience during that. And would that cause further confusion? For example, someone who is far along maybe in the Alzheimer's process or far along in some kind of neurologic disease where they're not able to communicate their wishes. So is that okay? And I think that's an open question that as providers and as researchers, we'll need to ask ourselves. Next slide. So where is the research? What are we looking at now that we finally can look again? Next slide. Psilocybin, as I alluded to, is given in a controlled condition in most studies. It's not like when it was used by indigenous people or when it was used for recreational use. The set and the setting of research on psilocybin research studies is very regulated. The set is the psychological state of the user. The setting is the environment. Usually it's given in a treatment room where there's 2 facilitators or therapists available. These facilitators or therapists are often of mixed sex, one man, one woman. A lot of times what happens in the room is recorded. And it takes an amount of time. As you can see, well, from my slide, the prep time before the study, 5 to 8 hours of psychological prep, 5 to 8 hours during the psilocybin experience. Remember, I told you it lasts usually about 6 hours. And the follow-up, 3 to 5 hours afterwards, patients go see a psychologist or a therapist for that integration time, for the rewiring to occur, for the new circuits to be established. I'm bringing this up because how it is used in studies is usually how the FDA will want it labeled. So if it's being used in studies under these very controlled conditions, and you're looking at it and a facilitator's time is not going to be free. The space involved in establishing a treatment room, that's not going to be free. And it's also going to limit the number of people who will have access to the drug. Next slide. I looked this morning on clinicaltrials.gov. There's currently 181 clinical trials being listed in clinicaltrials.gov on psilocybin itself, 559 on psychedelics, the broader topic. Of course, this doesn't include all studies. Many studies of psilocybin are occurring outside of the United States where there may not be as much push to be registered in the clinicaltrials.gov database. That's a voluntary database. Remember, kind of pushed here by certain companies and certain individuals, but outside of the United States, that's not required. So at least 181 clinical trials are going on and have gone on psilocybin. Major indications that have been tried are major depression, treatment-resistant depression, PTSD, which also MDMA is being used for, anxiety, addiction, Alzheimer's dementia. And I'm going to just kind of throw in, I've even seen things recently on migraine headaches. And so it's being used for all sorts of different indications. It's like people are throwing it out there and just seeing what happens. But we do need to do research, so we need to find out how it's going to pan out when it gets into the human body. Next slide, please. Major depression is probably one of those areas that it's been most studied in and that there have been some positive results. We talked about the deactivation or the normalization of the hyperactive prefrontal cortex by psilocybin and the decrease in the activity of the amygdala, which would decrease fear, anxiety. The mood of the patient seems to be more positive on the drug. And sometimes in depression, there's a slowness of recognition of facial emotions in the depressive state, where on psilocybin, there have been several studies where patients were shown these faces and they can recognize the emotions and they can recognize what's going on. So there's a definite objective improvement in the patient's depression. Next slide. I've put up here only 4 studies, major depression, that have been published. There are many others. You can see that there have been very few side effects, very few adverse effects, well tolerated, no problems. And again, if you look at the treatment methodology, you're going to see that set and setting, the fact that it's given episodically and that it's given under controlled conditions. And although the dose has been pretty standard in most of the studies, we're starting to experiment a little bit more with using different doses and maybe even microdosing. Next slide. A corollary of depression is existential distress at the end of life. And it's an important thing for us to look at tonight as medical ethicists and as lawyers and as medical professionals, because this is a place where maybe psilocybin has a great role. I think we need to look past the hype. Let's look at the science and see what's going on here. At that point in a patient's life, sometimes they've been given news that they're not going to live very much longer. There's a lack of purpose, hopelessness, and loss of autonomy that can occur. They see people around them that they are getting to know in clinics passing. And there's a very difficult stage that people can go through, very depressed and very hopeless, where they're not enjoying life at all. In that situation, psych meds take time. Those other antidepressants take time. The ones that work on the synaptic cleft that build up the neurohormones, they don't work overnight. And, another 4 to 6 to 8 weeks for something to work for you to find the optimum dose, this patient doesn't have those kinds of things to spare. Right now, it's being studied in several small studies, but it is not the primary indication that pharma is going after, because the big bucket, the big financial bucket, is actually with depression. But it's a corollary of that. And so even though it's not the big indication that pharma is going for, it has been studied there, and we do know it works. There may be a need for expanded access in these cases. Remember, patients at that point really coming into the city to be able to go to a treatment room, to be able to do those things financially, to afford that when they're trying to afford some very expensive chemo drugs. There are not just a few patients are being driven bankrupt by the chemo drugs that they're taking at their end of life. And so another expensive therapy might make things outside of their access. These are all things we need to think about when we're thinking about how we're going to place psilocybin in the regulatory structure, because it may leave these patients out. Some people even said if maybe you could give someone a reason for live, maybe it would postpone their wish to have medical aid and dying. Maybe they would want to live a little bit longer. Time will tell, studies will tell. Next slide. So we need to consider several things here. Next slide. One of the things I want you to consider is it's not just psilocybin we're talking about tonight. There's a whole family of compounds. Medicinal chemists have been active. If you look at the website for several different companies, you're going to find not only psilocybin being marketed, but derivatives of psilocybin, some of them very specific, more specific for the site of action, some of them with a shorter duration of action, which would actually help that long duration in the treatment center, and some that are very novel in their approach. Cybin is one of those companies that has several compounds in development. Next slide. And as you can see, several of them are far along in development. 50 granted are pending patents, and a lot of preclinical studies have been completed with Cybin's products. Next slide. The next company I want to talk about is MindMend, another company that's looking into psychedelics and psychedelic research into psychopharmacy. Next slide. And as you can see, they even have some studies that are very close to phase 3. Next slide. Compass is a third. It's a biotechnology company, they say, dedicated to accelerating patient access to evidence-based innovation in mental health. Next slide. So it brings up a lot of unanswered questions, doesn't it? Not just the dose, duration of results, and number of treatments for psilocybin, but how these other compounds, how these other molecules are going to fit into our picture from a regulation standpoint, as well as a marketing standpoint and an access standpoint. Right now, the studies that we do have a little bit of uncertainty with them, whether they are new therapists that sit with the patient or maybe a trusted therapist that sits with the patient during the episode. Will that affect what's going on? And again, most studies, there's going to be an unknown therapist that sits with the patient, so it may affect the results. Blinding is hard with these drugs. It's really hard to find a good agent to blind with. So it kind of brings a little bit of bias into the study itself. What is the optimum setting for the effect? We need to know what the long-term side effects are, episodic dosing versus microdosing. And I would really like to see us use more biomarkers in studies to see if we can pinpoint objective scientific evidence that these things are doing what we want them to do, especially since there is so much hype around psychedelics right now, so much media attention, and even from some patients and some professionals, so much fear. So are analogs better therapy through medicinal chemistry? We're going to find out soon. December 2025, PCN 101. December 2027, your Cybin has a drug coming out, CYB003, that is going to be very close, and SPL 026 in 2027. So these analogs are right on the horizon and are going to complicate y'all's decision when you're talking about how you're going to regulate these agents. Next slide. So I'm going to say, can we reach beyond the hype to look at the science? We need to be objective. We need to look at the data. That's what we need to do in fairness to the patient, in fairness to the scheduling, in fairness to having good access to patients that are in need of this therapy. Next slide. Problems with the hype, fear, and increased regulation can lead to barriers for care. That stigma, whether it be fear of what that counterculture looked like in the 60s that was using it, or whether it's this social media pressure to use cool psychotherapeutic drugs and microdoses, we have to say, let's step back. Let's look at the science. Let's look at this set of drugs, just like we look at any other set of drugs that we use in psychopharmacy. We need to look critically at the data and apply the science. Next step. Next slide. One of the things that kind of stands in the way of using these drugs easily and effectively are the risk evaluation and mitigation strategies, the REMS program, which I know is going to be part of any way that these drugs are accepted. It's a drug safety program that the FDA requires for medications with serious safety concerns to ensure the benefits of the medication outweigh the risks. There are regulations involved for screening, prescribing, and monitoring drugs that are in these programs, and every drug is different. So as a pharmacist, I have to memorize which REMS program means what, how do I have to monitor the patient, whether or not this particular patient can have the drug, et cetera. It's a little bit complicated. Examples of current drugs: clozapine, ambrisentan, and ketamine spray. Can be complicated and intimidating, more paperwork for providers and for patients and for pharmacists. Next slide. There are criteria to move drugs from schedule to schedule. We should hope that the DEA looks at the science and does this objectively and looks at psilocybin one by one to see where it should fit. People talk about making it a C2. Does that really make sense? Or should it be more like ketamine in the C3 group? It's not addictive, doesn't show dependence problems. It seems like it fits better into something besides a C2. Next slide. And the social hype, that's strong. And it's a push right now. It's a fad. It's something that's fun. It's different. The prior association with the hippie lifestyle and the counterculture, though, is still something that makes people of an older generation a little bit fearful of using the drug. And that may serve as a barrier for somebody at end of life to decide to try it. Recreational use versus medical use. Once these are approved, there's going to be all sorts of concerns about recreational use. But should that make us deny patients that need the drug because there's a possibility that it can be abused? And looking at the data, is it going to be abused? I don't know. It doesn't seem to be addictive. Could be used for recreational use, but it doesn't seem to be something that's going to cause craving or addiction. Next slide. This is a fun article that was in the Wall Street Journal not too long ago, talking about the working woman's new life hack, magic mushrooms, executives and soccer moms that are microdosing psilocybin using gummies and using candy bars. An interesting read, but like I said, there's a lot of social hype around psychedelics right now, and it's becoming a little bit more mainstream. Next slide. Stigma impacts objectivity. The healthcare providers' objectivity, patients, payers, politicians, and government. Their age, patients' age, politicians' age, what they remember from the 60s or what they saw when they were little, looking towards those that were in the 60s. And then maybe the younger generation, that kind of stigma is not there anymore. It's going to affect what you're doing when you go into legislate and litigate. Next slide. From the view of the pharmacist, paperwork, trying to keep it straight, trying to keep patients safe. The schedules of controlled substances are so confusing for us now. Cannabis, where is it? Some people can use it, some people can't. It's a Schedule 1. It's difficult to implement policies when someone comes in the hospital that needs ketamine, because then they go home and how can they get ketamine now? They have to go to a special place. It's potentially intimidating for the pharmacist, whether they be a health system pharmacist or a community pharmacist. And then, of course, what's going to be covered later, the risk to the medical professional by using it or dispensing it. Next slide. As an ethicist, increasing the availability of a treatment for research and clinical use that has shown promising results in several different difficult situations increases beneficence. But you have to implement strategies that balance that benefit with the safety problems. It looks like psilocybin doesn't have a lot of issues, but we really don't know. We don't know a lot about the adverse effects yet. Respecting patient values with a right to try, and then awareness of potential need to consent in some situations, some study situations where a patient may not be able to give their full consent to a treatment that may not be pleasant while it's going on, respecting their autonomy. Next slide. To me, access is going to be the key ethical conundrum with these drugs. Balancing factors with regulations, with getting things through that could decrease the availability or increase the restrictions on the patient being able to access the med. We need to think more towards designing systems that can lower the barriers of high therapy costs so that more people can afford it, more payers can afford to pay for the drug, and keep our eye on equity, because it's not fair that only maybe higher, more affluent, higher income, more affluent patients can afford the drug, whereas others are struggling to just survive, and they'd love to try it, but there's no one who's going to pay for it, and they can't pay for it out of pocket. Or the regulations are so stiff, they can't find a provider that will give it. Next slide.
And it's time. Thank you so much, Linda. It's time now for Stephen Field to look at this from his really quite unique perspective as an ethicist, as an internist, as a gastroenterologist, and as a person of a certain age who has friends who have used psilocybin. And Steve, I'm going to unshare my screen so that you can share your slides. And please take us on a journey.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure yes. So yes, I am of a certain age. I'm of that group of whom it's been said that if you can remember the 70s, you weren't there. But I was there, and I can remember the 70s. So what I'm going to talk about, and some parts of this have been alluded to already, so I'll go through them quickly. But it's the ethical viewpoint on mainstreaming the treatment of these conditions with drugs like psilocybin, with psilocybin itself. Just as background, Linda had mentioned the fact that psychedelic comes from mind manifesting. These drugs are also referred to as entheogens, also from the Greek, meaning to bring into being the God within. And gives an indication of how people thought about psychedelic agents as they were manifesting sort of higher powers within people. The classic psychedelics are primarily derivatives of either tryptamine or phenethylamine. Tryptamine derivatives are LSD, psilocybin, and DMT, which was mentioned. DMT is dimethyltryptamine. And of course, the thing to remember is serotonin, which we're all familiar with as a neurotransmitter, is 5-hydroxytryptamine. So these drugs are all related to tryptamine, which is why they stimulate the serotonin receptor, the 5-HT2A receptor. The atypical psychedelics include ketamine and a drug called ibogaine, which is derived from a tree shrub in Africa. Now, okay, to advance. Right. I'm going to go through this sort of modern timeline, which was mentioned before. First of all, Arthur Hefter, whose name has sort of been lost to this story, isolated mescaline from buttons of the peyote cactus back in 1897, But the story really begins with Albert Hofmann, who synthesized LSD from ergot. Ergot is a fungus that parasitizes certain grains. For a while, it was thought that ergot poisoning was the cause of the Salem witch craze, and that's been disproved. But LSD was synthesized as actually a cardiac drug originally, and it sat for 5 years until 1943, when Hoffman resynthesized it, contaminated himself, and probably absorbed through the skin a small amount of LSD and had a minor hallucinogenic experience. And a few days later, he decided to take a dose of 250 micrograms and had a major hallucinogenic experience actually while riding his bicycle home from work. Sandoz marketed the drug, interestingly enough, to physicians and researchers because it appeared to reproduce schizophrenia or the schizophrenic hallucinations and schizophrenic thought disorder. Of course, it wasn't terribly good at that, but it did produce these hallucinogenic experiences. And in the 50s and 60s, all the way through the 60s, you had several hundred patients involved in trials for psychiatric indications, both with psilocybin and LSD. What changed things, as mentioned, was the counterculture, the culture of the 1960s and 70s, the widespread use of hallucinogenic agents. Timothy Leary at Harvard turned to and drop out, and the war on drugs. And so when the Controlled Substances Act was passed in 1970, there was almost a vindictive aspect. This was going to squash this research specifically because this was not the research, but the people using it were part of the generation that the generation in control did not like. And that's the reason probably that it got scheduled as one, because as been mentioned, these drugs have no addictive potential. So psilocybin, these are some of the trials for which psilocybin has been used. It sort of came back to life in the early trials around 2011, actually, with end-of-life anxiety, this existential dread. And those trials, and there was the 3 landmark trials were at UCLA by Grob, at Hopkins by Griffiths and his group, which really became one of the major groups doing this, and at NYU by Ross. They found that a single dose of psilocybin changed these were done in patients with metastatic cancer and limited lifespan expected. And the patients appeared to lose their fear of dying and lose their depression and their anxiety. It was one dose. The dose lasted several months. And this was really sort of a landmark. These 3 were kind of landmark studies. It's also been tested in depression, and it's received breakthrough therapy designation from the FDA for both treatment refractory depression in 2018, and then generally for major depressive disorder in 2019, and again in 2024, as recently as March. Alcohol use disorder has been another indication. There was an early study, totally non-randomized study, but psilocybin was given to patients who were chronic drinkers, and 50% of the patients achieved sobriety over a period of 6 months, 6 to 8 months, and remained sober for that period of 6 to 8 months. It has been used for smoking cessation as well. There are trials in opiate use disorder as well, and in post-traumatic stress disorder, although more of those trials in PTSD have been done with MDMA, which is a derivative of methamphetamine. And MDMA has received breakthrough designation from the FDA for PTSD, and that will probably be the first drug that comes to market for that indication. The last 2 here are sort of interesting. Alzheimer's disease and then anorexia nervosa. Alzheimer's disease is, well, we all know what Alzheimer's disease is, but one of the properties of psilocybin, as well as some other psychedelics, is that they appear to encourage neuronogenesis, new growth of neurons, and formation of new synapses. This is the correlate of rewiring. And the hope is that in some of the dementias, especially in the dementias, earlier in the dementias, because the brain has a tremendous amount of neuroplasticity, the ability to change its connections, that new synapses may form, and there may be some improvement in cognition. Currently, there is one trial in Alzheimer's disease listed on clinicaltrials.gov, and that's actually for depression in Alzheimer's. So I couldn't find a trial specifically looking at cognitive improvement as a primary outcome. But obviously, there's a huge unmet need in Alzheimer's disease, and so those trials will be forthcoming. One of the problems with trials for Alzheimer's disease, one of the major issues, ethical issues that comes up in any of these drugs, is the issue of informed consent. That issue is going to be even harder with dementia for a reason that I'll get to in a moment. And then the last one there is anorexia nervosa. And anorexia nervosa is a really difficult disease to treat. It was always considered to have the highest mortality of any psychiatric illness, although there are studies that suggest that opioid use disorder actually has a higher mortality. But still, it's a very appreciable mortality. And we really don't have any good drugs for anorexia nervosa. There are 4 trials currently open, or recruiting anyway, for anorexia, for use of psilocybin in anorexia nervosa. Now, if you look at all of these, with the exception of Alzheimer's disease, there is a common thread, or there appears to be a common thread that runs through them. And I say this is hypothesis, and as was made clear in the introduction, I'm not a psychiatrist. But they are often characterized by repetitive or ruminative patterns of thinking. For depression, certainly. For anxiety, which isn't on this list, but anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder also got a breakthrough designation for psilocybin. Anxiety and depression both involve often repetitive thoughts, ruminative thoughts. The addictive disorders, or the habituated disorders like smoking and opioid use and alcohol, may also represent patterns of thinking that need to be changed. PTSD as well, and anorexia also fits into that category. Now, there are multifactorial reasons for these, that are speculated for these illnesses. But it is not a stretch to think that something that affects the default mode network, that sort of rewires the brain temporarily, allows for new modes of thinking, may in fact benefit, maybe one of the common threads that benefits all of these. One of the problems with anorexia nervosa, as it is with Alzheimer's, has to do with consent, but for a different reason. Anorexia nervosa is a condition that is often considered egosyntonic, meaning the patient considers the disease as actually part and parcel of who they are. Ego dystonic, it would be more characteristic of things like depression, anxiety, conditions that the patient does not want to have. So the question of patients consenting with anorexia nervosa would be their choice, but many of them may elect not to. And obviously you can't have somebody else consent if they're objecting to being trial. Now, the treatment with psilocybin, again, as was mentioned, is 3 phases. There's a preparatory psychotherapeutic session, which involves an assessment of the psychology of the person. It also involves getting consent for the process. There's the drug administration and an observation session lasting 6 to 8 hours, where 1 dose of the drug is given. 2 observers are in the room, and in many of these studies, there has been recording of the sessions. And then there are a follow-up, usually of 3 integration psychotherapeutic sessions. The drug itself, the dosing session, simply, we think, allows for the opening of this new rewiring. The integration sessions are critical for processing what has come up in those sessions. So the treatment is all three of these sessions. Many people say, well, it's the drug. It's the drug that's going to do everything. It is not. In fact, that is the reason that this is usually referred to as psychotherapy assisted psychedelic treatment, because both components are important. So what are the ethical considerations in the use of psilocybin? Well, first of all, there's related to the research structure. I just happen to really like this cartoon. There's 5 people sitting on the couch, and there's 5 people in this ecstatic dance, which of course is taken from a Matisse painting. And the caption is, so I'm guessing we're in the placebo group. And that's the problem with blinding trials like this. You really can't. There are 2 ways that blinding's been done with a very, very low level of the active drug, a level that is felt not to cause any physiologic symptomatology or manifestations. It's not 100% clear how much activation at the subclinical level is going on. And the other way is by using niacin. And niacin reproducibly causes facial flushing, tingling in the face and the fingers. So it gives the idea that there's a physiological effect. But most patients probably understand that they're in either the drug group or the placebo group. And certainly the therapist who's in the room with them during the procedure understands which group they're in most cases. And this leads to the possibility of both therapeutic misconception and expectancy effect. The therapeutic misconception is the idea that patients know that they're in research, but they're actually expecting to get treatment to get the active ingredient because they want treatment of their condition. The expectancy effect is the effect on the researcher. It's felt that by hoping to get an effect, they can actually, in a way, project that hope onto the patient, and the patient then conforms to that. Other problems with the research have been exclusion or exploitation of marginalized groups. Most of the studies that have been done, the patient population has been between 80 and 90% white. There are more men than women in these groups, but that's probably because of the large number of studies done with PTSD, which is common in combat veterans more than men. Interestingly enough, in some of the studies looking at end-of-life anxiety, up to 50% of the patients had previous experience with hallucinogens. And it's not clear, in the studies, it's not clear how that was broken out. What does that do? Are those people more or less likely to have a therapeutic effect? And then the other issue is the comprehensiveness of the psychedelic therapist training program. Now, how does a word, before we get into this, what is the mechanism by which specifically psilocybin is felt to work? Not the neurochemical or neurophysiologic mechanism, which is the effect on the default mode system. But it seems that the people who do the best, that correlates with the production of what's called a mystical experience. And there are actually validated psychological scales to assess this. And the mystical experience usually consists of 4 parts. The patients report the transcendence of time and space. Time and space lose meaning for them. There's a positive mood. There is what's called a noetic experience, a sense of obtaining great knowledge, a sense of what has been described as oceanic boundlessness, and what's described in psychological terms as the dissolution of the ego and ego boundaries. So patients, if you will, sort of lose the sense of where they end and other people and the world begins, and they have this sort of communion with other people or with animals or nature or God or whatever. And the last component of it is that the patients describe it as ineffable. The definition of ineffable is unable to be described in words. And the reason I bring that up is that if we say that the mystical experience may be crucial for the production of the long-term benefit, how exactly do we go about getting informed consent? And when ethicists have looked at this, the recommendation has been for something called enhanced informed consent. Consent for psychedelic administration is different from consent for psychotropics, like regular antidepressants, for example, because once the drug is given, the patient can't control the nature or the duration of the experience. So they can't actually withdraw from, at least from the drug part of the experiment. The drug is in, the effects are going to happen as long as they're going to happen. And that has to be communicated to the patients. The second one is, how do you explain to a research subject that they're going to have an experience which people who have had the experience can't explain? And so it becomes complicated to do that. People have to understand that we don't actually know what this experience is going to be like for them. Now, some people would say, well, lots of times when we do research with drugs, we don't know all the side effects of the drug. But this isn't the side effect of the drug. This may be something critical for the production of the drug. So it's actually different. Discussions also needed about possible adverse, not only physiological events, those would be the hypertension, the rapid heart rate, the nausea, the headache, which are fairly common and which patients can understand, but also potentially adverse psychiatric events. Psychosis has been reported with LSD. There was, that I'm aware of, one episode of psychosis in somebody who was treated with psilocybin, but that person had a strong family history of mental illness and should not have probably been in the study. And in fact, that's an exclusion criteria for all studies. Anxiety is fairly common. It can be significant during the dosing session, and then it usually tapers off, but it is something that needs to be discussed. HPPD is something called hallucinogen persisting perceptual disorder. In the vernacular, it was called flashbacks. Again, more common with LSD, not seen commonly with psilocybin, but patients do need to know about this in advance. And the changes in consciousness are sort of sleepiness, some mild confusion. Again, these are extraordinarily rare. But if the standard of informed consent is what the reasonable patient would want to know, these are things that the reasonable patient might want to know. The flip side of that, of course, is that the psilocybin induces a state of suggestibility. So how do you tread that line? The last point here is discussion about effects such as dramatic and unforeseen changes in personality, values, beliefs, and identity. One of the effects of the drug can be to actually change personality structure somewhat. Most of the time, in most of the studies that have been done, this is for the better. But people need to know that it's going to happen, and that they're going to become, in some ways, they're going to have a different way of thinking about things than they did. And that might affect their interactions with people that they know in their life. And the example that's always given, and it's probably sort of talking with a straw man, is the person who is an atheist and is treated and then develops profound spiritual feelings and deep religion. And this is fine, and this is not something that necessarily he or she may be bothered by, but it may impact their relationships with other people. So again, this is just this is an enhanced informed consent. There's also the fact that patients with a history of trauma, and this is especially in the PTSD group, may re-experience traumatization or the emotions associated with traumatization during the psychedelic experience. And this also happens in regular trauma-informed psychotherapy. But it doesn't happen acutely. It doesn't happen suddenly, and it may not be associated with the degrees of either emotion or or possibly hallucination. And then two other questions that are just sort of related to informed consent. Should practitioners disclose prior experience, either prior experience in treating patients or prior personal experience using psychedelic agents? If there is a transference present to the therapist, which there often is not because it's usually a brand new treating therapist who's doing that, the fact that the person has not used psychedelics may, to some patients, imply a disapproval. Or if they have, it may imply sort of a, you should go ahead and do this. So that has to be considered. And then lastly, for research, how will that be collected and confidentiality maintained? These patients all carry a DSM psychiatric diagnosis, and they're in a clinical trial with a drug that is currently legal, and that has associations with the counterculture, as was mentioned before. And then there's the issue of touch as part of this consent. The use of touch during these sessions is very problematic. The use of touch in general in psychotherapy can be problematic, certainly in classical psychoanalysis or psychodynamically informed psychotherapy. It's pretty much proscribed. You touch the patient. And I imagine it probably is similar in most forms of psychotherapy. But it needs to be addressed in the consent process because patients will go through this experience, and some patients ask to have their hand held, ask to be comforted, but they're particularly vulnerable during treatment. And it is probably best to avoid touch, which can have all sorts of not only repercussions, but all sorts of symbolism for the patient. In the unrestricted, non-clinical trial world where psychedelics have been used in large groups, for example, at concerts, there's certainly a history of boundary violations, including sexual assault. Now, that there are ways to protect against that. There is, that I know of, one issue that came up in a trial of MDMA, not psilocybin, but where there were two therapists in the room, and these sessions were recorded, and the recordings were not checked all the time, but it was very clear in the recording that there was inappropriate touching and inappropriate behavior and cuddling and things like that. The MAPS is the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, and they have issued guidelines about touch. But one of the guidelines is that there should certainly be no sexual touching. There isn't actually a definition of what sexual touching is, and hand-holding to somebody in the middle of one of these experiences could be construed as sexual touching. So the question for patients that needs to be asked is, do you want to be touched if needed? Do you not want to be? And then what happens when they change their mind? In general, if they say they don't want to be touched, they shouldn't be touched, although it may be a problem for the therapist to have somebody who is very upset and crying and asking to hold your hand. So this needs to be worked out in advance as part of the informed consent. And this is suggested disclosure informations and questions for consent to psilocybin. This is from an article by Smith and Sisti called Ethics and Ego Dissolution, the Case of Psilocybin. It's a Journal of Medical Ethics in 2021. And it actually gives some of the particular statements that would constitute part of this enhanced informed consent. You may think you're communicating with higher powers. You may feel profound connections that would seem odd to you. There may be open, but when we talk about potential long-term changes, it is sort of interesting that all of the ones here are basically not so bad. And they say this changes may lead you family to perceive you ways. Some information about the mechanism of how this works, or at least how we think it works. And then there's a section on therapeutic touch. And the question, we would never touch you unless you wish. Would you like us to? And we should talk about how to communicate during the experience, because it's very hard. A patient can't give consent to anything once they've actually taken a psychoactive drug. So this is part of the enhanced informed consent. Now, that informed consent really speaks to the ethical principle of respect for persons, as it's denominated in the Belmont report, or that maps onto autonomy, the Beecham and Childers formulation. The concerns that I've mentioned also go to beneficence and non-maleficence. Essentially, people need to know what the potential side effects are. The third pillar of the Belmont report, or the fourth pillar of the Beecham and Childers schema, is justice. And from the standpoint of justice, there needs to be equitable access to clinical trials. Justice is usually defined as an equitable sharing of benefits and burdens across a population. The clinical trials in psilocybin, as I mentioned before, the patients were overwhelmingly white. People with disabilities were not present in these trials. Indigenous patients, who are really the people who brought us these medicines, are not represented in these trials. So we need to know what the effect of these drugs is across a population. For some of these studies, we know how white people respond to the drug, and that's not really enough. We need to know how all groups respond. There should probably be a reevaluation of exclusion criteria. Currently, people are excluded. But the studies are mostly done between the ages of 18 and 65, 18 and 55. So we don't know how the population of, for example, of adolescents who do have PTSD, who do have opiate use and alcohol use disorder, who do have depression, we have no idea how those people will fare. And it would be hard to get consent because you're asking a parent for an under 18-year-old to consent to something that may change the personality of your child at the time that the child is developing their personality. So that's a problem. People who were also excluded were people who were incarcerated. Partly that may be responsible to the fact that early experiments back in the 50s and 60s often used people who were incarcerated. But it's probably not a good deal, not a good idea to be in jail and having a psychedelic experience and then having to integrate what went on. So we don't look at those people. We don't know how people with coronary artery disease, for example, or severe hypertension would fare, because those are excluded on the basis of physiological side effects. And then very importantly are cost considerations. If these drugs are approved and marketed, the course of treatment doesn't consist of just the drug. It consists of the prep session, the dosing session, the integration sessions. And those three are expensive. You have two therapists, or two people, either a therapist and a guide, or two therapists in the room for up to 8 hours. It's been estimated that a course of treatment, and this is not for psilocybin, but for MDMA, in other words, one set of treatment like this for MDMA would cost about $15,000. When this is approved, it's not clear that all insurance companies or any insurance companies are necessarily going to cover it. And then there are a lot of people who don't have insurance, especially people who may not be able to work, for example, because of the severity of their psychiatric illness. So it may be that some of the people who would most benefit are not going to be able to access this medication. And we need to think as a society of how we're going to handle that. What's going to be done for that. There is going to be probably some objections to broadening this, because there is still a stigma, and B, some antipathy towards these drugs from some people who consider this part of a quote unquote drug culture. These are holdovers from the people who were around earlier, but they are not stigmatized drug culture indications. These are indications for a really important drug for diseases that we don't have a lot of good treatments for. The other issue under justice is the issue of cultural appropriation. The drugs were used in indigenous populations for centuries. They're usually used as part of sacred religious ceremonies. The farthest back that we know of is actually 3750 BCE. And the reason we know that is because in archaeological sites in the Southwest United States, basically in Texas and also in northern Mexico, at sites that were felt to represent communal gatherings, there have been bowls in which peyote buttons have been discovered, and also a certain form of red bean. And from both of these, active mescaline has been, after all these years, isolated. So we know these were used that far back in the Southwest United States. And that's peyote, which is mescaline. Psilocybin was used by the Olmec and the Maya about 1500 BCE. That is known because many of their wall and decorative paintings show people surrounded by mushrooms or people using mushrooms in certain ceremonies.
Steve,
Yeah.
do you have a thought as to whether these issues of cultural appropriation are manageable in the context of research studies to move psilocybin toward wider legal availability, or are they a reason why we should not be going down this path at all?
No. I think there is a way of approaching that. I think if anything, it actually buttresses the argument for legalization rather than sets it aside. And just lastly, the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece. People were taking ergot preparations to induce a hallucinogenic state. So there's a long history of the use of these drugs. And the question is, if psilocybin, for example, what is going to happen to the supply? How will indigenous people who use psilocybin for their ceremonies, and in fact, it's legalized in the United States for use by Native Americans, members of the Native American Church, in their ceremonies by the American Indian Religious Freedom Act.
Yeah, and that obviously calls into question the short-term detriment balanced against the long-term benefit to indigenous communities and communities as a whole. But let's hold that thought. I'd like to bring Dan in so that we can talk about how the criminal law is making it difficult for this discussion to broaden itself. And then I want to come back in our discussion to the issue of how the supply will operate. Steve, can you unshare your slides so I can share Dan's slides? And thank you so much. We obviously could have gone on for hours longer on the cultural and clinical history of this. And from the comments that I'm seeing, there is clearly a desire for a second program to address more of the clinical details if this in fact becomes something that is more widely legally available, either by prescription or not by prescription, which of course is sort of the experience we've had with marijuana in the last 10, 15 years. So next, first participation code is MAGIC. For those seeking CLE credit, write that down. There'll be a second code right at the end. And with that, I bring you Dan Arshak, who is a criminal defense attorney. Full disclosure, was my law partner for many, many years, is one of my closest friends and a constant source of advice about why does it matter that something's illegal and what's going to happen if you get caught. So Dan, take us down the drug enforcement rabbit hole.
Well, it is a rabbit hole. Thank you, David. And thank you, everyone, for tuning into this. It's an interesting issue, and I thought that it might make sense to provide a little history of how we got to where we are. As David said, I'm a criminal defense attorney. I spend my life where the rubber meets the road on the criminalization of drugs. The war on drugs criminalized possession and use of all kinds of drugs, and over the years, it's put millions of people behind bars, many of them people of color. The Controlled Substances Act, the CSA of 1970, came into effect the first year. You're ahead of me, David.
Yep, I was re-displaying the participation code because I didn't realize that my screen wasn't shared.
Okay, dokie. Richard Nixon became president January 20 of 1969. The CSA came into force in 1970 and categorized psychedelics as Schedule 1, meaning they were dangerous and had zero medical value. As a result, federal funding for psychedelic research dried up. Nixon declared drug abuse as a public enemy number one in a press conference in 1971, positioning the government to increase federal funding for drug control agencies and proposed measures such as mandatory sentencing and no-knock warrants. Under Reagan in the 1980s and his Just Say No wife, Nancy, they bolstered the war on drugs through policies that led to the mass incarceration of individuals, particularly for crack cocaine offenses, which were more severely penalized than the same amount of powder cocaine, a disparity that affected African American communities disproportionately. At that time, there was a 200, the ratio was 1 to 200 of crack cocaine to powder cocaine in terms of the sentences that people were exposed to. According to the Federal Bureau of Prisons, as of 2021, approximately 45% of inmates in federal prisons were incarcerated for drug-related offenses. The Bureau of Justice statistics for 2016 indicate that 15% of state prisoners are incarcerated on drug-related offenses. And in both state and federal prisons, 70% of prisoners convicted of drug-related offenses are non-white, people of color. Studies show that African Americans obviously are incarcerated for drug charges at about 6 times the rate of white people. Harsher sentencing for crack cocaine associated more with African American communities versus powder cocaine, also traditionally associated with the white users, has exemplified those disparities. We are now the leader in the number of imprisoned individuals, and this spike was largely due to drug-related offenses. Internationally, the U.S. also exerted influence on other countries to enforce similar drug policies affecting global drug regulation and enforcement, and creating the opportunity for immense cartels to corrupt governments to the highest level to permit drug manufacture and exports. But psychedelics are different. Why did they fall into the CSA at all? Well, it was in large measure the culture and political climate. During the 1960s, there was a significant cultural shift with increasing experimentation with psychedelic substances among the youth and countercultural movements. The use of psychedelics, often associated with anti-establishment and anti-war sentiments, prompted a political and social backlash. Psilocybin, along with other psychedelics like LSD, became symbols of the countercultural movement, leading to concerns by many about social order and drug abuse. And this association influenced the decision to control those substances. At the time, there was limited scientific understanding of psilocybin and its effects, the lack of comprehensive research, and the prevailing negative attitudes towards drugs contributed to its classification as a Schedule I substance. The broader war on drugs, initiated in the late 1960s and early 70s, aimed to regulate the use of those substances, and the criminalization of psilocybin and other psychedelics was more about controlling a perceived social problem than based on any scientific evidence regarding harm or therapeutic potential. In recent years, however, there's been, as you know, a resurgence of interest in the potential therapeutic benefits of psilocybin, leading to research and reconsideration of its legal status in some areas. And of course, David and Dr. Aggarwal, who I understand is among our audience today, have played a significant role in moving that ball forward towards the goal line. Science pretty much ignored psychedelics for almost 4 decades. Then in the 2000s, researchers quietly began studying psychedelics again with private funding. And over time, research increased, and eventually a national movement sprang up to move psychedelics off of Schedule I, with so far no significant change, but we're on the right path. Congress enacted the CSA in 1970 to combat drug abuse and control the, quote, legitimate and illegitimate traffic and control of substances. The primary feature of the CSA is the scheduling system. Drugs are classified into 5 schedules based on their accepted medical uses, potential for abuse, and effects on the body. Remember those 3 things: accepted medical use, potential for abuse, and effects on the body. Schedule I drugs are defined as drugs with no currently accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. And we'll look at what some of those drugs are. Schedule 2 through 5 rank others from most to least dangerous based on relative potential for abuse and dependence. Controls and penalties align with the drug scheduling. The lower the schedule number, the more restrictive the controls and the more severe the penalties for violations. Notably, schedules exist apart from the FDA's regulations governing the approval of new drugs for interstate marketing under the FDCA, Federal Drug and Cosmetic Act. Non-FDA approved drugs may not be marketed interstate under the FDCA, regardless of their placement on the CSA schedules. And moving a drug to a higher number, that is less restrictive schedule, to like from 1 to 3, does not approve it for interstate marketing, but it may remove some additional regulatory barriers. Congress made the initial scheduling decision about CSA and provided an administrative procedure for future scheduling and rescheduling. Under the transfer of a drug between schedules may be initiated by statute by the Attorney General, quote, on his own motion, or 2, at the request of the Secretary, or 3, on the petition of an interested party, like, thank you, Dr. Aggarwal. Congress contemplated that the classification set forth in the CSA as originally passed would be subject to continuing review by the executive officials, but nothing much has occurred in that regard. Congress legislated the CSA against the backdrop of federalism. As such, the CSA presumes and relies upon a functioning medical profession regulated under the state's police power and prohibits the federal government from making what are called anterior judgments about what constitutes accepted medicine or medical treatment, and manifests no intent to regulate the practice of medicine generally. So how does the DEA intercede to stop these processes? Well, soon after the Supreme Court's decision in Chevron, which I'm sure you all are intimately familiar with, Chevron basically held it was an incredibly important decision of the Supreme Court, which basically ushered in a new era of judicial deference to agency interpretations of statutes that held that agencies are free to consider and interpret their own regulations consistent with their expertise, and courts should not do so. That rubric is now being reconsidered along with Roe by the Supreme Court. The DEA promoted a novel interpretation of no current accepted medical use in treatment in the United States, that phrase justified by a string of circuitous judicial and administrative proceedings set forth a 5-factor test that for currently, in order for something to be currently accepted medical use and treatment, it must be shown that the drug's chemistry is known and reproducible. There are adequate safety studies. There are adequate and well-controlled studies showing efficacy, and that the drug is accepted by qualified experts. Finally, the scientific evidence is widely available. Now, under that rubric, virtually none of the drugs which were originally on the schedule of controlled substances have moved off or up on the schedule despite advances in science and changing social mores. You might not be aware of the changing landscape of law enforcement towards psilocybin, but the first slide shows that David has had up there, how that landscape has changed. If you look at the slide, well, you now have all been staring at it for some time, you see that for 5 years, over the course of 5 years, from 2017 to 2022, the volume of seizures has increased by over 300%. So this is also coincident with the recognition by many of the beneficial properties of psilocybin and therefore its increasing availability. I noted that somebody in the comments has informed us that, in fact, psilocybin is easily available on the internet, something that wasn't so much available well, 5 years ago. So if we could go to slide 2, let's look at who uses and how and the frequency of the use of, David, if you can expand that a little bit. These are the results of the 2022 National Survey on Drug Use and Health, presenting national estimates from the National Survey on Drug Use and Health. That's perfect, David. In this slide, you can see psilocybin is highlighted on the left. Psilocybin use is fairly constant across adult age ranges, but the most important numbers are all the way over age 26 plus. 12.3% of the surveyed individuals in 2022 acknowledged using psilocybin. Note, by the way, that that's happens to be, and I guess it may or may not be coincidental. I think a social scientist would be better placed than me to explain whether it's coincidental. That's the exact same statistic for the use by age 26 plus of LSD, and only something less than for all hallucinogens, which is at about 20%, just below 20%. Now, what's 12% of adults? Well, I thought to look and discovered that there turns out there are about 260 million adults in the United States. Now, granted, that's from 18 to 85. The numbers understandably go down after 72, but let's just call it a round number, 260 million. 12% of that is 31 million people in the United States using psilocybin in 2022. That's a lot of psilocybin, and that's a lot of LSD. And we are not inundated with the ill effects, certainly of psilocybin. So, an important statistic to keep in mind. We are, however, inundated with prosecutions for psilocybin. And as you saw, there's a 300% increase in seizures of psilocybin. And while we don't have statistics on how many convictions we have for psilocybin, we do know how those convictions for psilocybin, a Schedule I drug, are calculated. David, I note that we're close to out of time, and I know you want to save time for questions. So maybe I'll put a pin in it at this point. Really up to you.
Well, no, I'd like you to go 2 more slides and we'll run over a little bit. I'll show the second participation code right at 8:15, but if people want to hang around for a little bit of discussion, rest assured, this is not the end of our treatment of the psilocybin rescheduling and psilocybin use issue. I have plans now, lots of suggestions for additional programs that we could do. So this is not the only discussion we're going to have. But yeah, if you could go on to your next 2 slides, that would be
Absolutely.
great.
So in federal court, and state courts vary across the country. In federal court, sentencing is based on an equivalency system. The equivalency system plays a critical role in ensuring that the punishment for any particular drug is proportional to the quantity and type of the drug involved, reflecting both the drug's potential for abuse and its societal impact. So these are some of the equivalencies for common Schedule I drugs. The way that they do it is to suggest that, look at heroin, that a gram of heroin is bad. It's equally bad to a kilogram of marijuana. And so were you to be sentenced for possession of a kilogram of marijuana, you would be exposed to a certain sentence in prison. And likewise, because it's equally bad to 1 gram of heroin, if you had 1 gram of heroin, you would be sentenced to the same amount of prison as that person who had a kilogram of marijuana. You can see how that goes forward. Heroin is really bad. It's equivalent to 1,000 to a kilogram of marijuana. LSD, oh my goodness, is equivalent to 10 kilograms of marijuana. It's really, really bad. Well, since marijuana is the equivalency standard, of course, 1 gram of marijuana is equal to 1 gram of marijuana. Ecstasy is equal to half a kilogram of marijuana. And psilocybin, when it was scheduled and has remained the same as marijuana. 1 gram of psilocybin is equivalent to 1 gram of marijuana. It's going to take a lot of psilocybin to get you a prison sentence, and we'll look at that in just a minute. Mescaline and there's other hallucinogenic drugs that are not scheduled here are on a different schedule. Let me move forward to slide number 4. And you can see,
oops. There we go.
Yeah. So these are Schedule II drugs. Cocaine is 1 gram of cocaine is equal to half a kilo of marijuana. That's powdered cocaine. Crack or base cocaine is 1 gram to 2 kilograms of marijuana. There's still a significant disparity. Now it's 18 to 1 as opposed to 200 to 1. But it still means that people in Black and brown communities where most of cocaine base and crack are used will be getting, have been getting, and continue to get significantly longer sentences than their white counterparts who primarily use powdered cocaine. Methamphetamine, 1 gram to 2,000 to 2 kilos of marijuana. Fentanyl, really bad. It's as bad as LSD. It's the exact same bad as LSD. PCP, well, not so bad. It's only as bad as heroin. Uh, if it sounds a little bizarre, it's because it's a little bizarre.
Well,
And
this is probably the perfect moment to shift our discussion to how this law enforcement mindset has adversely affected our ability to advance medical therapy. So, Dan, if you have a closing sentence, please.
um, well, I had wanted to talk a little bit more about Dr. Aggarwal, who I hope is still in the audience.
It
Uh, uh,
is.
but I'll take the opportunity just to once again to thank him for what I know was a tremendous effort and time on his part to move this ball forward. And I really do encourage all of you, I will say, all of you who advocate permitting the use of these medicines to patients who can benefit from their use. It's time to write to your representatives and, of course, vote.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dan. This has been an incredible conversation, and the comments and questions in the Q&A box have been very, very well framed and pointed, and there's been a good deal of advocacy going on in the Q&A, which is always a good thing. There are just a couple of questions that I feel like we have to address, or we have not even fulfilled our narrow purpose for tonight, which is to look at the issue of rescheduling. And that is, what do we want to accomplish in the research that will move the DEA? And I think there are perspectives from each of the three of you on what good would come of rescheduling psilocybin and doing much more research in all of the areas that you've talked about and that people have raised in the Q&A. Where are we trying to get? Linda, what should psilocybin be treated like in the alcohol, marijuana, speed continuum? What is your thought from a pharmacist's perspective?
Well, just looking at from a pharmacist's perspective, to keep it simple, it's really hard for us to figure out what's going on here and there with all the different complicated things. I guess I'm just thinking of just the way cannabis and ketamine are being worked with now, but especially cannabis. It seems kind of dichotomous to have a Schedule 1, but it's really being used for many very worthy conditions. Um, Looking very objectively at the DEA criteria, I mean, I really don't think that psilocybin fits into such an addictive category that it should be a 2. But I don't know where it's going to end up. I certainly would hope that it doesn't stay a 1. What do you think, David?
I'm with you on 3, but I'm really interested in hearing what Stephen has to say. What is it we're trying to accomplish here, Steve?
Well, I'd agree. I would imagine it would be rescheduled as a 3. It really has no addictive potential. It just needs the data to be, to be gathered and then presented. There's just a lot of stigma about it. There's a resistance because of it has a different mode of action, but I can't imagine why it wouldn't be scheduled. I think it should be a 3, which means they'll probably make it a 2. But right.
Fair enough. And Dan, from the perspective of a criminal justice advocate in your role as the Center for Community Alternatives president, what do you hope to get out of the rescheduling discussion?
Well, the vast majority of people who are prosecuted for drug-related offenses are not being prosecuted for recreational or therapeutic drug possession or use. And so we're talking about in my world of criminal defense, we're talking about a very small slice of individuals who may, by rescheduling, be exposed to far lower sentences than they had been exposed to in the past. But as I said before, 1 gram of psilocybin is equivalent to 1 gram of marijuana. And in very few jurisdictions does anyone do, even in state court, does anyone do significant time for a small amount of this particular controlled substance. So from the fact that there's been significant seizures of larger and larger amounts of psilocybin means that those people or entities that have had that drug seized with rescheduling would be exposed to an even lower level of criminal sanction. So there is that. But in the criminal world, rescheduling is not going to have a significant impact on very many people.
Thank you. So for those of you who have to run and want the second participation code, it is mushrooms. And there's been a flurry of discussion in the chat box, all of which is really interesting. I had privately thanked Dr. Aggarwal for all of his work and for being here. Catherine Tucker just joined the Q&A chat. I thank her for her work as well. And I really think this question from somebody named Sam is a great way to sort of bring the formal program to a conclusion, though we can stick around and talk some more. Sam asks, given what is known in 2024 about psilocybin, is the major constraint to rescheduling a political constraint? I think it is certainly in part political, the sort of residual manifestation of the war on drugs, Dan, that you referred to. But I think the impact of fentanyl and the DEA's just intense desire to deal with fentanyl will be a positive and a negative influence on this debate, because they just aren't so concerned about lots of other drugs. The DEA has almost no concern about marijuana these days. And I'm thinking maybe they will recognize that keeping psilocybin as a Schedule I drug is counterproductive. And I think, or I hope, that we will get some encouraging support from the FDA as part of the process that the Ninth Circuit has now said belatedly and grudgingly ought to move forward. That's my hope. Any thoughts from the three of you? Someone.
My only thought is that the work of you, David, and Dr. Aggarwal and the others associated with that kind of effort, that legal effort, that's what's going to move the ball forward. The DEA will look. It's a matter of politics and the constituency that will be served. So the constituency are people who have issues, psychiatric issues and mental issues and disabilities. These are not the people who are the constituents that our politicians look to serve primarily. And yes, focusing more on fentanyl and drugs that really do and can and are killing people in larger and larger numbers is something that the DEA can, does, and will focus on. I'm guessing they're going to throw up their hands and say, "Oh, what the heck? We benefit in no way by having this argument any further." They won't concede the point, but
Right,
they'll throw up
right.
their hands and say it's time to move on.
Steve, anything you want to contribute to the therapeutic value of psilocybin and what the DEA and the FDA ought to do next?
Well, I guess, I mean, in my sort of naivete, because I don't understand how the DEA works, but if they have a definition that says that the drug is has a high potential for abuse and has no medical indication, and you have data that shows from randomized controlled studies that there's a medical indication, forgetting even then I mean, the only reason they would keep it there would have to be political.
Right. Look, the reality is that drugs like ketamine and cocaine and PCP are not Schedule 1 drugs. That being the case, there is just no ethical or scientific rationale for psilocybin with all of the history and lived experience of indigenous communities demonstrating its safety and effectiveness. There just isn't a rationale. An anonymous attendee put something in the Q&A that I think really drives this point home. They asked, are we missing the point here? Why does the DEA get to set the epistemic standards for safe pharmacology for the FDA when the FDA lets devices into use with very little scrutiny? Why does the DEA set the standards, and why are they so hard to question? So the DEA doesn't so much set the standard as it is the gatekeeper for the review by the FDA that could lead to a different clinical conclusion. As a technical legal matter, once the FDA opines that psilocybin has or has the potential to have a legitimate medical use, just as cocaine does, just as ketamine does, then the DEA is duty bound under the Controlled Substances Act to reschedule it. Doesn't mean they will, and it is altogether possible that we will have to be back in court. I think we can wrap up tonight as only the first chapter of our discussion of these issues with a comment from Catherine Tucker, the lawyer who has been pushing this fight forward for, I think it's been decades, Catherine. She said, and I love your verbiage, KT. She said the Ninth Circuit smacked down the DEA in the case Ames versus DEA. That's the Ames 3 case. Those who are keeping track. It is now for the DEA to consider the rescheduling petition properly, and at minimum, they ought to normatively, and they need to technically, legally, at least send this to the FDA for the FDA to weigh in. And then we can have the separate fight over whether the DEA ought to be restricting access to psilocybin for broader research purposes in the first instance, because we need more research in lots of different communities so that we understand how this drug works on other than white males. That's a fight that I think we're all ready to have, but we can't have that fight until the FDA has opined, because in response to the point raised by our anonymous friend, that's what the law says, right? So we are working within that part of the system until it refuses to work, and then we litigate. Wow. So I've kept you late. I thank you all for staying with us. Thank you for joining us. Reminder, the second participation code is mushroom, because we have to have a sense of humor. And if you have suggestions beyond those that have already been put in the Q&A for topics we should cover when we resume this discussion, I will certainly welcome them. dnh2101@columbia.edu. And the struggle continues. Thank you all and good night.